Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickery of Space Command, and a bunch of other stuff. And today we're going to talk about Star Trek Discovery, Season 2, Episode 8, If Memory Serves. And, you know, the last two episodes, the two previous episodes, I was saying that Star Trek Discovery seemed to have hit its stride, it seemed to be on a roll. Well, I guess it rolled to a stop. Because this was a story that could have had great potential, great possibilities, and kind of, for me at least, missed the mark. And we'll get into that. See, here's one of the problems. When you're doing a show that's about the season arc and not self contained stories, then invariably there are going to be episodes, and they shouldn't be. They all should be dramatic, they all should be exciting, they all should be emotionally moving. But the problem is that frequently, if you've plotted out your entire season to have a big finish, then there'll be episodes that are kind of connective tissue, and this one felt like the connective tissue episode. The beginning of it was terrific. It started with a recap of The Cage, the original Star Trek pilot with Jeffrey Hunter, which I love. It's one of my favorite Star Trek episodes. Jeffrey Hunter's terrific. John Hoyt is wonderful. It was wonderful interviewing John Hoyt. When I wrote The Twilight Zone Companion, I asked him about being the first ship's doctor on the Enterprise before DeForest Kelley, and he told me that another actor who came in on audition for that role with him was Ed Platt, who played the chief on Get Smart. So think of that. That would have been an interesting role for him to take on. But John Hoyt was terrific, and you've seen John Hoyt in a million things. He's in Twilight Zone and Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up, in The Lateness of the Hour. He's in When Worlds Collide. He's just a wonderful actor. He was one of the Mercury Theater actors with Orson Welles, and on and on. Terrific guy, wonderful man, and so it starts with a recap of The Cage, and it's terrific and so much fun previously on Star Trek, and they're calling back, over 50 years, 55 years. But then it match cuts to Anson Mount playing Captain Pike in Star Trek Discovery, so it's a close of Jeffrey Hunter to a close of Anson Mount. All that was great. All that was great. The problem was, we go back to Talos 4. Now, first of all, those of you who don't know Star Trek history, uh, originally they shot the Star Trek pilot with Jeffrey Hunter. It didn't sell the show, and then they shot a second pilot with William Shatner, and it sold the show. But then they had this pilot, and the question was, well, how can we use that since it doesn't have the same lead actor? And they came up with this brilliant idea of doing a two-part episode called The Menagerie, where basically Captain Pike has gotten injured in an accident saving these Starfleet cadets, and he's left in a wheelchair, terribly scarred, where he can only go boop for yes and boop boop for no, and that wasn't played by Jeffrey Hunter. I believe it was played by Kevin Haney, who's actually written a book about it, and he's a really interesting guy too. So so we go into this episode, and they're going back to Talos for Michael and Spock, her adopted brother, and Spock is played by Gregory Peck's grandson, and he's actually very good. I really thought he did a good job. And my favorite line in the entire episode is where Spock insists that Michael ask him a question that he can answer, and she responds, "How do you think that beard's working for you?" Which is really funny, really really good. And but the rest of the episode, here's the problem I had with it. In the original episode, The Cage, they go to this planet, they encounter these stranded colonists, and there's Susan Oliver, who's just astonishingly beautiful, and bright, bright blue eyes. Jeffrey Hunter, of course, was incredibly handsome, bright, bright blue eyes, and then the colonists are in incredible shape. How is this possible? And then it turns out that it's an illusion. None of them exist except for Susan Oliver, Vina, and it's these aliens, the Telosians, who live underground, and they have a power of creating illusion, and they're trying to breed different alien species to basically perpetuate their own planet's sentient population because they're dying out. And it was just great in every way. The acting was wonderful. It was wonderfully directed by Robert Butler, whom I have interviewed about the episode he did of Twilight Zone with George Takei, The Encounter, and I really would love to sit down with Robert Butler and have an audio commentary on The Cage, because he's the first guy who ever directed Star Trek. He's the first guy who basically figured out how that would work in terms of its vocabulary, beaming down, all that stuff. and but it's one of the great pilots ever made, phenomenal. And supposedly they didn't buy the show because they felt it was too cerebral. Majel Barrett played number one, which I actually liked a lot. Later, she'd play Nurse Chapel. She was Roddenberry's mistress, and then later his wife. And she had a harshness that worked very well for number one as this sort of woman who was very logical and very commanding and very decisive. And I liked it a lot. I wish they had continued that character. And Rebecca Romijn has taken over that role now in Star Trek Discovery, but she basically had a walk on more or less. And we'll see if they bring her back in a more definitive role, or more definitive, doing more. So, but so the cage is basically life and death. It's the question is, will Jeffrey Hunter capitulate to these aliens' fantasies, or will he fight back and perhaps even risk dying, and showing that humanity will die or prefer death over being imprisoned. And it's just a great episode. It's life and death. It's very dramatic. The pacing is terrific, and Susan Oliver's unforgettable. There's a wonderful documentary about her called The Green Girl, because in the original pilot, in the cage, she's painted green, and they kept sending it to the lab, and kept coming back flesh colored, and that was because the lab thought that it was a photographic mistake, and they were correcting it, but they have to keep shooting the dance scene over and over again, painting her greener and greener and greener until they figured out what was happening. So then it becomes the Menagerie, and it's a brilliant two-part episode of Star Trek. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And they have uh, the way they work it is it's death to go back to Talos 4. The Federation Starfleet has an edict over that planet. It's forbidden to go there, but Spock commandeers the Enterprise to take Pike back there. And it's just wonderfully dramatic. It's life and death stakes. It's it's just great. It's just great in every way. And Malachi Throne is wonderful as the Commodore, and he was originally going to be the voice of the of the main Telosian, but because he was a guest star in the Menagerie, they dubbed it with a different voice. But even so, the idea of casting women as the Telosians and then giving them male voices made them so interesting, and the big heads with the bellows that would make their heads throb, the veins in their heads throb when they were doing telepathic stuff or casting their illusions, just phenomenal, just phenomenal. And and they used some of the monsters, some of the creatures from Outer Limits in the other cages, and it was just a very inventive. And then the two-part Menagerie, they changed the ending of the cage to make it work for Pike going back. And again, brilliant use of pre-existing material, because in the original cage, Pike, Vina can't go with them because she was actually injured in the crash. She's a middle-aged woman. She's hideously deformed. It's a great transition, a on-camera makeup transition, terrific. And there's the question of, well, the Telosians are humanoid, and they couldn't figure out how to put together a human. A little dicey, but okay, fine, give them that. But she's horrible looking, and they give her the illusion of beauty and youth, and then at the end of the cage, the original pilot, Pike says, you'll restore her beauty, and the Telosian says yes, and more. And he looks over and he sees her heading back to the Telosian encampment or enclosure with a fantasy duplicate of Pike himself. Now, interestingly enough, that was great to use in the Menagerie, because when they redid it and had Pike horribly, disfigured and paralyzed, then the whole idea is that Spock, who is loyal to him, has risked everything to take him back there so that he can be reconstituted as a fantasy version of himself, full-bodied and handsome again, and be with Vina. So it's the same shot, but with a very different meaning. So just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So okay, so now we get to If Memory Serves. Now, if memory serves, you've just remembered a better episode than this one. And here's what's wrong with it, because I've been thinking about it, and it's the difference between dramatizing something and just talking about it. And I'll give you an example. First of all, they go back to Talos 4. Spock's been ranting and raving and giving the coordinates backwards so that she'll take him to Talos 4. And Section 31 is on their heel, and, the Discovery's trying to get to them, and so on and so forth. And here's the challenge. First of all, Vulcans are telepathic. And if the thing is to get into Spock's mind and revisit these moments and so on and so forth, well, then why doesn't Michael just mind meld with him? Why do you need Telosians? Telosians aren't telepathic so much as, they are, but that's not their gift. Their gift is casting illusion. And they don't really do that much in this episode. And the design of them is not nearly as interesting as the original Telosian design. It's, they cast a man as a male Telosian, they cast a female or whatever. It's like, it doesn't look as, it's not as well designed, not as well sculpted. It's just clunkier. It's not, when you, in the original episode, when you saw those creatures, your jaw dropped. It was just like, wow, these are so alien and so cool looking, and brilliant. Meg Wiley, who played the lead Telosian, was just great. I saw her on stage some years later. I should have brought a photo of the Telosian for her to sign. I really wish I had, but just impeccable. But so in the new episode, if memory serves, so they take Spock back there and they're reenacting the schism between them and between him and Michael, and they're it's like the two kids playing opposite each other, but then some of the lines are Michael and the adult Spock, and it's just kind of wacky. I mean, basically, it's like, oh, let's go back into Spock's memory, and he didn't kill those people back in the mental ward. Well, okay, but again, if Mind Meld would have proved that, and then also it's like going back to that issue where she, blew Spock off and it damaged their relationship. This episode is basically about the people in your life and who they are, and can you trust them, and do you know them, and all of this stuff, and the actress who plays Vina is not nearly as striking nor interesting as Susan Oliver. And so again, it's like, it's they're they're not being as scrupulous in the different details of making that episode, and so essentially, it's Vina and Pike again, and she kind of bids him farewell. But if this is the original Star Trek timeline, he's going to end up in a wheelchair going beep, and they'll ship him back to Talos 4 at some point in the future. And but meantime, Michael and Spock are having their contretemps, and it turns out that what was the schism? They've been painting us through 2 seasons of she and Spock don't get along anymore because of something she did. Okay, great. And it was basically she ran away from the Vulcan household because she was worried that the human league, the pro-logic league, whatever it was called, would burn down the house and kill all of them because she was there, which makes no sense at all. None. Because if it was like an anti-human league or something like that, well, Amanda, Spock's mother, is human and Spock is half human. So Michael running away really doesn't make any sense at all. And also, and she says, "I don't want you with me, you half-breed." And he's like, gets all pouty and cryy, and and it's just kind of like, if you want to see a version of this scene that works, go back to the original Star Trek and watch, I think it was called This Side of Paradise, and it's the one where Spock gets blasted in the face by these spores from a plant and falls in love with Jill Ireland, which is not a hard thing to do. She was, by the way, she was David McCallum's wife at the time, interestingly enough, and he was in Man from U.N.C.L.E. at the same time as this. And she was very, very myopic, and so she did the role without her glasses, but she couldn't see anything in front of her, really. I mean, she had these amazing blue eyes. Again, RCA owned NBC, and they wanted to sell color television, so the whole idea of Star Trek being very brightly colored was deliberate, and was actually used in RCA Victor TV ads of the time, of which I have one. I'll have to show it to you guys sometime. And so then, essentially, it's like, okay, so what was it? She ran away and she called Spock a half-breed. But in This Side of Paradise, in order to get Spock to help Kirk at the end and save the day, Kirk has to get him angry, and he does by kind of calling him a dog-faced boy, or someone who could be in a freak show along with Jojo the dog-faced boy, and he kind of pisses Spock off, and Spock gets angry, and it really works. It's a great scene, and Spock finally, basically dukes it out with him, and then he's, purged of the spores and can be Spock again, and blows off Jill Ireland and goes on to the next adventure, and she's never mentioned again because that's how TV worked in the '60s. But in this episode, if memory serves, so it's like the Telosians are needed to kind of reenact these things, which they aren't needed, frankly, and Vena's not interesting, and there's nothing really. It's not incredibly dramatic, and it's talked about. It's like she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Spock," and he says, "Well, I saw through it, and I know that you didn't mean it, but it was like, but it forced me into more logic," or whatever the hell he says, and it was like, it's not a moving scene, and maybe by the end of the season they'll come to a meeting of the minds, but they haven't yet, and he's just kind of being a jerk, and she's kind of, and what she did back then was like crazy, pointless, and but also it's not dramatized. And by that I mean, okay, I've been watching all these episodes, and I don't remember the anti-logic league or whatever it's called, or the pro-logic league. First of all, it's not logical to kill them and burn down the house. It makes no sense at all. But let's say for a moment this is the pro-logic league and they hate humans. Well, then you should have them attack the house and burn it down. You should have them do something violent, and you should explain why they don't care about Amanda, they don't care about Spock, but they're targeting Michael. You have to dramatize. You have to have scenes where we live through those things so we can understand it, because otherwise it comes out of the blue and it's just talking, 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 and then furthermore, it's sort of like, and also by the way, if I were going to have Michael be his foster sister, I would have made Spock older, not younger, because we've seen a lot of Spock younger. We saw him in JJ's movie as a kid. We saw him in there was a DC Fontana cartoon yesteryear in the animated Star Trek, where we saw him as a kid. There was even a Viewmaster of that animated episode, but seeing him as a teenager, except for Star Trek 3, where you see him briefly as sort of a wacky-looking teenager going through Pon Far, we never saw that. And the idea that Spock, as a teenager, is trying to win his father's regard and his father's affection, and he feels very ashamed of his mother and very ashamed of a half-human side. And then all of a sudden, they adopt this human kid, and it's like, is she supplanting him? Is she replacing him? Is she going to prove that a human can be more Vulcan than a Vulcan? There's all sorts of really interesting stuff you could have played there, and making her younger would have worked really, really well and really interestingly. And I would have liked to have seen that, frankly, rather than what they've done. And and also, in the Menagerie, they say that it's death. The sentence is death if you go to Talos 4, but somehow in this episode, it's mainly just forbidden to go there. They don't mention the death sentence, and so that again, lowers the stakes. And then also, so the Solosians are just kind of props. Venus just kind of by the wayside. Oh, and then the other plot line in this, because again, whereas previously they would have either one major plot line, like with Saru, or they'd have two major plot lines that actually did dovetail. With this one, they've got Hugh, and Stamets, and they've got the whole notion that Hugh, has all of his memories, but isn't really. He doesn't have the emotions. He doesn't connect to the memories. It's almost like he's a different person who's been given these memories, and that's actually very interesting. But the problem is that the emotional dynamic is kind of wacky also, because the more dramatic choice, if you've ever, you should go and check out a movie called Solaris by Andrei Tarkovsky. There's an American version that I don't like nearly as well, but the Russian version is great, and the novel by Stanislaw Lem is great. And the basic notion in that is a guy left his wife, she committed suicide, he has guilt over it, and now he's on a space station orbiting a planet that's entirely a sentient ocean, and it's reading his mind, trying to make contact, and it summons a duplicate of his wife to interact with him, and she's his wife and not his wife. And there's this strange feeling of her being an alien, and yet she looks like his wife, and she has the memories that he has. And so it would have been much more interesting, rather than Stamets saying, well, I love you, and we've got to get past the fact that you died, if it were more, you're back, but are you who I think you are? And yet you have the memories, but you don't have the feelings. And to have Stamets to dig in on that, and have Stamets treat it seriously and be disquieted by it, would have been much more interesting than just having Hugh be the one talking about it and Stamets wanting to sweep it under the rug. Because again, we're looking at what has the most dramatic juice between main characters, and then Hugh goes off to duke it out with Tyler, and Tyler doesn't become Vok. He stays Tyler and doesn't beat the shit out of Hugh, and okay, fine, but I'm sure they're going to pay off all this stuff, but it's sort of like the problem with Stamets saying, "Oh, I just love you, and you are you, and let's just get past this and forget that you died, because it was the worst thing that ever happened to me." It happened to you. The worst thing that ever happened to you. It makes him seem like an idiot. It makes him seem shallow. And what you want your main characters to seem deep, have a deep well of emotion. And it's much more interesting if Stamets were loved him and didn't know if he should, didn't know if it was really Hugh, would feel very uneasy. I mean, think about if any of you who loved somebody were put in the position where that person died and then came back and seemed not the same person. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is another great example of that. Yeah, there's just a lot more emotion to mine. Again, for me, the problem with this show and where it reared up again was about they're talking about rather than getting into the emotion, rather than getting into the meat of it. And for me, as a writer, director, producer, my goal is to move my audience emotionally. You have to move them emotionally. Then you can inspire. Then you can do all the other stuff, make them think, etc. But first, you have to get to the heart, their heart. And the way you do that is by taking them through the journey with characters they empathize with. So, so that's my basic review, long-winded, of If Memory Serves. I think there's 2 more episodes left of this season. We'll see where they go. Hopefully, they'll be as good as the last two. But but as much as I love the idea of going back to Talos 4 and having the Telosians, I really wish they'd made more of it and done a better job of it. I think, you know, but for anyone who hasn't seen The Cage or hasn't seen The Menagerie, do yourself a favor and look them up. They're quite wonderful, and they were revolutionary for television of the time. There was nothing that had been ever like these shows. And that opening shot of The Cage, where you go in on the dome of the Enterprise and pass through it to a bird's eye view shot of the crew panning down, craning down, was just spectacular. They've corrected it subsequently in the redone versions with the effects changed to make it smooth. Back then it wasn't perfectly smooth, but remember, we were all watching on TVs, about yay big, and you couldn't stop or freeze frame or go back and watch again. So it just went past, and you saw it in real time, and it just looked phenomenal, wonderful. And so anyway, so that's my review. We'll be talking a lot more about various things. We're going to be launching the crowdfunding campaign for the comic book, the crowdfunding campaign for shooting the rest of the second Space Command story. We're going to be doing the film history. Of science fiction, the TV and radio history of science fiction. Lots and lots and lots to talk about. And if you're in LA, definitely give a holler. And we're going to have a Space Command convention in the months to come. We're going to have a premiere at the Chinese Theater, and in Hollywood, the famous Chinese Theater. And so lots to come. Don't forget the spacesuit contest, and don't forget the Name the Creature contest. We'll be talking about that more very, very soon. So for now, it's Mark Zickrey. Glad to have you aboard. Remember to subscribe to Mr. Sci-Fi. Go on to Patreon. Throw a few bucks my way. It really helps. And if you want to buy Space Command shares, $7,500, and you're part of this adventure, and you can really be helping it move forward. So that's it for now, and we'll talk again really soon. Bye, guys.